we will try and focus on a unique application of the halachas of Shahiya, which is how the halachas of Shahiya impact the Shahiya of water, mayim, seemingly a very common and simple shaila, but as we'll see, the sugya of Shahiya as it impacts mayim, as it impacts water, is a unique sugya, and which has a number of ramifications, halacha l'maaseh, as Be'ezer Hashem will set out. We'll begin with a halacha that is not about mayim, and that is a halacha that Tosfos brings on Daf Mem Ches Amud Aleph, middle of Divrei Maskil, the Zaysim. Tosfos quotes a Hira in the name of Rabbeinu Shmuel, the Rashbam. This halacha is similarly quoted by the Rosh and other Rishonim. Omer Rabbeinu Shmuel, the muter losum tapuchim etzel ha'esh samach l'chashecha. Apples can be put near the fire, samach l'chashecha, close to Shabbos. Afal pi shelo yuchlu litzlois mi b'yayim, even though they will not be. The word literally tzli means they will not be roasted, but in this case it means they won't be cooked without water. They won't be cooked through heat. Mi b'yayim, prior to the beginning of Shabbos. The ne'echolim tfei k'moy shehin chayim mitavshel shenizbashel k'machal ben drusot. Ordinarily, even according to Chananya, Shahiya is only mutter if the tavshel, if the whatever item it is, has reached machal ben drusot at the point of Shahiya. In this case, the tapuchin are chai, they're completely raw. Nonetheless, the Rashbam says the reason why it's mutter is because the ne'echolim tfei k'moy shein chayim, they are more edible, raw, mitavshel shenizbashel k'machal ben drusot, then the tavshel in the state of machal ben drusot is edible. Seemingly, what the Rashbam is arguing is that if reaching the stage of machal ben drusot in BISHUL allows shahiya, and kol shekain, something which is nechal chai, something which is eaten raw, should have the status of something that's nechal kamachal ben drusot, and therefore shahiya should be mutter. Tosfos then goes on to ask. Is the word tfei dafka or lav dafka? I'm sorry? The word tfei, is it, let's say they're equal. Does it mean dafka tfei? We'll come back to that, Hashem. Tosfos then says, V'afagadu b'perek kamot tanan, the Mishnah. Ein tsoilin basar batzal ubeitza elo kadeshiyot tzuli min, one cannot leave whether it's a piece of meat or an onion or an egg, only if we fulfill the conditions of Shahiya, which means kadeshiyot tzulu mi b'yayim. So recall the Gemara then has a shaklavataria whether sheyot tzulu means machal ben drusot or mavushal called sarka, depending on the machlokes Chananya and Rabbanon. So Tosfos says, the Mishnah lists 3 foods. One of them is basar. Now basar is obviously not eaten raw, even though the Gemara in Chulin says that basar is chazi la'oitza, but it's certainly not nechal, as it's not as edible chai as it is mavushal. And so to a beitza, even though again the Gemara says that on beitza one can be doimei chai, one can swallow it chai, which is a sugya perhaps we'll learn Be'ezer Hashem in the sugyas of refuah. But again, it's not as edible cooked as it is raw. But a batzal, an onion, is eaten usually raw. So therefore, why is there an issue of a batzal? So says Tosfos, it's not as pleasurable as we'll see in the Magen Avraham. It's not as to put it in terms of the enhancement that BISHUL will create, a batzal will enhance BISHUL will enhance a batzal more than tzli will enhance a tapuach. So that's the halacha of the Rashbam. The Rashbam's svara is, again, to emphasize the key point here in the Rashbam, that because ne'echolim tfei k'moy shein chayim mitavshel shenizbashel k'machal ben drusot, therefore there is a heter to be shoya tapuchim, because they have the heter of machal ben drusot. Now, before we continue, although this is not directly our Indian, we're not yet Isaac and halachas of BISHUL, which we will be Hashem in the future. we have two ways to understand Tosfos' statement. We can either say that because tapuchin can be eaten chai, the same as if they are nitzleh, therefore tapuchin don't undergo a process and a transformation of bishul by being ala ish. The nafkamina being that the Rambam in Perek Gimel of Hilchos Shabbos establishes a klal that anything which is nechal chai, anything which doesn't require the transformation of bishul, doesn't have a chiyuv of bishul on Shabbos. What about tapuchim? Do we say that since a tapuach is not enhanced by the tzli, so therefore Tosfos is saying there wouldn't be a chiyuv bishul for tapuchim, and therefore we could say l'shittas Rambam that anything that's nechal chai, as well as if it would be nechal mabushal, would not have a chiyuv of bishul on Shabbos. Maybe. That's something that is not changed, and we'll touch on that Be'ez Hashem when we see the Egleita. So that's one possibility of learning Tosfos, that Tosfos is making a statement about tapuchim even in terms of bishul itself, which means that because the bishul doesn't enhance and doesn't alter the tapuach, it's identical to whether or not it would be eaten raw. Therefore, there's no meleches bishul at all. In which case, Tosfos would be saying that since the bishul doesn't in any way transform the tapuach, we don't find a chashash of shema yechate on something which doesn't have an issue of bishul. That would be one way to understand Tosfos. So to summarize, we have a Rambam that says in Hilchos Shabbos that mevashel dovar she'ein tzorich bishul klal is potter. Do we say that therefore Tosfos is simply saying that tapuchim, because they're necholim k'moshe and chayim, and are equivalent to something that has undergone bishul to the step of macha ben drusoy, therefore it's something that doesn't need bishul at all? That's one way to understand Tosfos. A second way to understand Tosfos is not making a statement about bishul at all. Tosfos is making a statement about shema yichata. Dahainu le'olam, we will accept that a tapuach is certainly changed and maybe even enhanced by undergoing sleep. Just since the shinui isn't significant and substantial enough, a person won't be over on chitui in order to accomplish that smaller degree of improvement that a tapuach undergoes by sleep. An ordinary tavshil raw is inedible and requires bishul to make it edible, hence the chashash Hashem yechate. In this case, since the transformation is not from inedible to edible, so for that improvement, which undoubtedly there is, which would involve a malacha of bishul, nonetheless there isn't a chashash Hashem yechate. This issue is discussed it's already touched on by Rabbi Kiva Eger, and the Egleital already points out that the shaila is discussed by a kadma in the Minchas Kayim. Rabbi Kiva Eger assumes in the Gillian in Siman Reish Nun Daled, b'toich dvarov, that in this case, tapuchin, Tosfos' shita will be that there is no isser of bishul d'oraisa, because an echolim chayim k'moishe k'moy. In other words, when Tosfos says that it is k'moishe and chayim mitavshel shen izvashel k'macha ben drusoi, Tosfos is considering that something that can be eaten raw has undergone the same transformation as something that was nizvashel k'macha ben drusoi. And therefore, the same way as we know, and we've touched on, and again, this is our opportunity to chazer over a number of key klolim that we've been learning over the last few weeks. We have touched on the machlokes rishonim, whether or not there's an issa bishul deraisa from macha ben drusoi until nizvashel called tzarikoi. The Mechaber says that there is an issa bishul deraisa, and other achronim say that we perhaps can be makel not like the Shulchan Aruch, because Rov Rishonim hold not like that. In this case, says Rabbi Kiva Eger and Minchas Kayim, Tosfos will be of the opinion that since it's equivalent to Machal ben Drusoi, therefore it does not have an issue of Bishul Deraisa. Rabbi Kiva Eger concedes that there may be an issue of Bishul Derabonon from Machal ben Drusoi until there's Bashal called Tzar. That's one way to understand Tosfos. The Egleital is cholik b'toikef on Rabbi Kiva Eger and Minchas Kayim, and he says that's not what Tosfos means. Tosfos Havada isn't making a statement about Bishul. There certainly is Bishul in the case of Tapuchim. What is then the svar of Tosfos? Why Tapuchim, because they could be Nechal Chai, don't have an Isser of Shahiya? So here we can mention a Tehillah LeDavid, whether the Tehillah LeDavid says, and we'll come back to this key svara of the Tila David in the end of Siman Shin Yud Chesed Kotin Yud Zayin, where the Tila David says that the svara of Tosfos has to do with whether or not one will be motivated to be mechata. And he says the chashash of Shema Yechate is not entirely related to the chashash of BISHUL. One nafkamina, which we'll touch on later, is that we know that, and again, going back to principles that we've learned, in the shaila of Machal ben Drusoi, we know that there are two shittas in the poskim if Machal ben Drusoi means a shlish of the BISHUL or chatzi BISHUL. The Shulchan Aruch HaRav, the Tila David says, paskins that benegeya to the chashash of chitui, he says chatzi BISHUL. Zot the Tila David, we can't infer from that the Shulchan Aruch HaRav will hold that benegeya to the shaila of BISHUL doiraisa, that until chatzi BISHUL it's not yet considered Machal ben Drusoi. Says the Tila David because there's a chiluk between BISHUL and chashash chitui. BISHUL would depend on the degree that it's transformed. Chashash chitui depends how mavushal it is to be edible for the person in terms of whether or not he'd be driven to be mechate it, kadei that it should be roy for his achila. Says the Tila David, chashash chitui depends on how much the person feels the tafshil is ready to be eaten. He says that the Shulchan Aruch HaRav says is totally chatzi BISHUL. Mimela says the Tila David, Tosfos' discussion by Tapuchin is whether or not Tapuchin, because the nechal chai, would one be driven to be mechatas? As Tosfos no, they're equivalent to Machal ben Drusoi.
Shulchan Aruch HaRav is solid or liquid? Now we're talking about the solid.
Shulchan Aruch HaRav is actually talking about mayim, but correct. And we'll get back to that. Like I said, we'll get back to it. Yes. So that's the hakdama to our sugya. We have the shita of the Rashbam. Whether to summarize, what the Rashbam says that one is allowed to be shoyer tapuchim because they are necholim tfeikim oishim chaim etavshos shenishbashal k'machal ben Drusoi, and we have a fundamental machlokes achronim between Rabbi Kiva Eger and the Minchas Kohen on the one hand, and the Tila David and the Eglei Tal on the other. What is the fundamental logic of Tosfos? Is it because Tosfos is making a statement about BISHUL, and this is a universal cloud, or is Tosfos making a statement about the chashash of Shema Yechate, that one wouldn't be motivated to be mechate something which is nechal to moishucha?
Could there be enough minute, but ain't BISHUL after BISHUL, something that's dry and it's cold before Shabbos, but it was already cooked? So you can't, there won't be BISHUL again, but it could be still
We'll come back to Be'ez Hashem. We know from the posting that there isn't chashash of Shema Yechate if it's mavushal called tzarki, even if it's in stanim, and we'll try and explain why that is. But the next step that we will now see is whether or not this Rashbam is brought lahalach. So on page 65 of the booklet, we have the Shulchan Aruch in Siman Reish Nun Daled. We have the Mechaber, and the Mechaber in Sif Daled paskins this din of the Rashbam. Peiros shenecholim chayim muter litnem sovev lakadeira.
Let's get
Peiros which can be eaten raw.
Let's get the page up,
can
please.
Be put around the kadeira. They will not be cooked before chashecha. That's the statement of the Mechaber. Now, we will recall, again, going back to a nidin which we've had frequent occasion to discuss in the last few weeks. We will recall that the Mechaber in Siman Reish Nun Gimel is not machriya. The Mechaber doesn't paskin if we hold like Hanania and Machal ben Drusoi is sufficient, or we hold that like Chachomim and that one requires Mavushal called Sarka. The Hachra of the Bir Halacha on this issue, as brought in the Mishnah, as brought in the Bir Halacha on the Maramakemis, that would be in Siman Reish in Siman Reish Nun Gimel in the Mishnah Berurah's pages, which would be Bir Halacha on page 75 of the booklet. Dibur Maskal the Nagu Lahokel Kisvar Achrei. So we don't have a Hachra of the Shulchan Aruch on the question of Chananya or Chachomim, but we have the Hachra of the Ramah, that the Ramah says Minig Yisrael was to be makel. Says the Bir Halacha, Ayin ba Bes Yosef sheherech harbe be'elu shtei adayos. The Bes Yosef is at length. We've seen this Bir Halacha. The Bir Halacha says that the kula that is nagu is based on the Rosh of Hanach Lem Yisrael, And therefore the Bir Halacha says, about 8 lines down, the Al Kein Lefizel Lechatchila Bevadai Toiv Lihizoyer, She'em Mevushel Kol Tzorkoi Koidem Chashecha Ulesal Koidem Ha'ash. So the Bir Halacha says that one should be Machmir Lechatchila to the Chachomim and ensure that it's Mevushel Kol Tzorkoi.
He's not around? He is around.
Let me try him. The Chazon Ish in Siman Lamed Zayin, Sifkot Gimel, the Chazon Ish is clearly on the Bir Halacha's understanding of the Rosh. That whereas the Bir Halacha understands, and again we're reviewing things which we discussed a number of times in the previous Limudim, whereas the Bir Halacha seems to understand that the Rosh is saying Hanach Lem Yisrael, which means a concept of Mutav Shiyu Shogigim, let Klal Yisrael keep them in it. The Chazon Ish says that no, the Rosh doesn't mean that. Hanach Lem Yisrael means that there were poskim that paskim throughout the Deiros like Hananiah. Hanach Lem Yisrael to rely on Rabbi Seim who paskim that way. And therefore the Chazon Ish says that Avada one can be Soimech on the Ramah, there's no reason to be Machmir, and one does not need, one can be Soimech on Hananiah and Machal ben Jusoi will be sufficient. Now here we have a Kushya Atsuma on the Bir Halacha. The Bir Halacha is saying that the Mechaber himself has not been maker like Hananiah, and the Raya is that in the Beis Yosef, the Beis Yosef gives a lot of weight to the Machmirim. Here we've just learned to Mefurish and Mechaber that the Mechaber paskins like Hananiah. What did the Mechaber just paskin? Peirish and Echolim Chayim Mutar Litnam Sovev Akadera. That's the Rashbam. What's the logic of the Rashbam? The logic of the Rashbam is because a tree that's Nechal Chai is equivalent to something that's reached the stage of Machal ben Drusoi. If one looks in the Bir Hagra, on that, in Siman Daled, Ois Yud Zayin, so it's the right-hand side of the page, the third column from the top, the Bir Hagra says the following: Kevon Shru'uyim la'ochlam chayim, loy gora mimachal ben Drusoi, toisis memchesam adalev, u'leshitosom the achar kemachal ben Drusoi. Sorry, this is toisis l'shitosoi. We saw that toisis, we learned it in Daf Lamed Aleph and Beis. That toisis paskins like Hananiah. So says the Gra, if we paskin like Hananiah, machal ben Drusoi is a heter, so nechal k'moy shluchai is a heter. Now, if the Mechaber hasn't paskined like Hananiah, so how could the Mechaber bring down this halacha? This kasha, the Svishas Shabbos brings on in the name of the Minchas Kohen. That the Minchas Kohen says that from this Mechaber we see clearly that the Mechaber has been machriya like Hananiah. And therefore the Shisa Shabbos suggests that Avada we can be makel like the Ramah because even the Mechaber is makel l'hakel. So the Dina.
The Mechaber clearly paskins like the Rabbanan and Gufim Tuma.
So he's chayshish to both shitas, and here he's being chayshish l'hakel. He's paskening l'hakel. As I state in Minchas Kohen, which is Shisa Shabbos is matik, and therefore on the Bir Halacha, the Shisa Shabbos says there isn't a reason to be machmir like Hananiah, and we could be maimed shitas HaChazon Ish. Both the Pri Megadim and the Machzah Shekel are madchik in the Shitas HaMechaber, that the Mechaber is only bringing this halacha if one is maker like Hananiah. That's Mavur Mitech the Pri Megadim and the Machzah Shekel. But Homios, this is the din that we have in the Mechaber. Gepaskind that one can be shoyeh peres chayim al kolponim, certainly if we're soymech on Hananiah. This is the hakdama to the sugya. Now we reach the second step of the sugya, which is the issue of mayim. What about water? Now, if we apply the logic of the Rashbam, that anything that's nechal chai is equivalent to machal ben Drusoi. Now, water can be consumed without being heated. Mayim should have a din of nechal k'moi shuchai. So if we would just have the halach of the Rashbam, we would say that there should be no sugya of shahiya according to Hananiah by Machal. And one would be able to be shaya mayim on a kira that's not gufo ketuma, a moment before Shabbos, because it's the same as peres shenechal chayim, and they should be equivalent to nechal machal ben Drusoi if you paskin like Hananiah. The Mechaber in Simulation Dal Tziftes, page 69 in the booklet pages. The Mechaber clearly says not that way. He says, page
69.
Very last sif in Simulation Dal. Lo yemale chovis shal mayim v'yite in l'techatanu erev Shabbos im chashecha. A person may not be shoyhem mayim samach l'chashecha Vim also came assume the Shabbos as the full choimer of a Shahiya that was carried out by Issa. Frek the Magen Avram in Sivkotan Chavov, right-hand column on the page. Afal gav de mayim ru'uyim lishtois chayim. Mayim can be drunk without being cooked. Zok the Magen Avram, first of all, mikol mokom einon toivim kol kach kepeiros, to Moshe Kosav Sifdalet, or yesh lo yimar the hocha mayri the koboyle lahadocha va'oz tzrichem liyos cham. So the Magen Avram says two things. First, he gives a very important qualification to the din of peiros. And he says that in the case of tapuchin chayim, it's only a question of altering it from being raw to being cooked, but there's no difference in the pleasantness and the palatability or any other aspect of the achil of the tapuchim. And therefore, it's equivalent to something that was machal ben drusoi. Masha'en came by mayim, even though the mayim can be consumed, so to speak, raw, but they're not as good. There's certainly an enhancement to the mayim when it's heated. There's a difference between water being drunk cold and a hot drink. So therefore, says the Magen Avram, the entire halacha of the Rashbam is limited to the case of tapuchim because there's no appreciable difference between ne'cholim chayim or ne'cholim uvushalim in the case of tapuchim. Whereas in the case of mayim, they are toivim yoiser when they're nischam. That would then mean, and the Magen Avram is referencing that something which can be eaten raw, but certainly undergoes improvement when it's cooked, wouldn't have the heter of tapuchim. So a vegetable which can be eaten raw, but is certainly enhanced by being cooked, wouldn't have the heter. That's the first heter to the Magen Avram. The second heter to the Magen Avram seems to say that mayim qualifies for having the same halach as peiros. The only case that the Mechaber is talking about when he says that there's also to be memalech chavesh shamayim is because you're going to use the chavesh shamayim for washing dishes, for hadocha. And in that case, mayim certainly cannot be used cold in the same as it can be used hot. The nafkamina would be, what would be the halacha to be shoya mayim to drink? According to the first answer, the Magen Avram, it would be aser. According to the second answer, the Magen Avram, it should be mutter. Comes out that according to the second mahalach of the Magen Avram, be'etzem, mayim, that is being heated for shtia, has no issue of shia. Lahalacha, the Shulchan Aruch HaRav and HaRav points out that we cannot be samech on this Magen Avram's second teretz l'kula, that mayim that's being heated only for the purpose of shtia does not have the halachas of shia, because he says there's kamarayas from the Rishonim that certainly when the Rishonim were discussing this mechaber of an issa to be shoya, they were certainly referring to shtia also. And therefore, Ladina, we have a basic difference between the Rashbam's halacha and between mayim. Mayim is osir b'shehiyah on Shabbos because we have the first teretz to the Magen Avram that einom tovim kol kach kepeiros. And therefore, Ladina, there will be an isser of shehiyah of mayim even if the shehiyah was being done just for the purpose of shehiyah. Let's now go a step further. If we now have reached the point that being shoya mayim for the purpose of shtia does not have the kula of the Rashbam, and even according to Hananya, that heter of shehiyah will only be in the event that we've at least satisfied the requirements of Hananya that it's nechal k'machal ben drusoi. What is the step or the level of BISHUL of mayim of machal ben drusoi as it applies to mayim? How do we measure that? So, b'soich dvarov, the Shulchan Aruch HaRav, kedarkoi, in a word, is megala to us how we apply the rule of chatzi bishul or shlish bishul to mayim. Now, what is the Shulchan Aruch HaRav's issue? The Shulchan Aruch HaRav is obviously struggling to define chatzi or shlish bishul in the terms of mayim because let's go back to first principles that we began the limud with. We mentioned the issue of tapuchim. that since tapuchim is nechal k'mois shehu chai, so that we then discussed from Rabbi Kiva and the Minchas Kohen, as opposed to the Eglei Tal and other Achronim, whether that means that there is no concept of bishul by mayim, or by tapuchim. Sorry, why? Because it's nechal k'mois shehu chai. It doesn't require the transformation of bishul. Therefore, the malach of bishul doesn't apply to it. One of the key issues that the Achronim raise with this, and the Eglei Tal himself touches on this, is if that's true, how do we apply the gedorim of bishul to mayim? Mayim is also consumable chai. We just saw that question. Mayim is also consumable chai, as the Mogen Avraham clearly says. So what then defines the melacha of bishul as it applies to mayim? So the answer will be the same way as the Mogen Avraham said, that the reason why there's an issue of shahiya by mayim, and the Shulchan Aruch says this is the ikateret of the Rishonim Ladina.
Because it's better hot.
Because it's better hot. But better hot doesn't mean that the mayim has been transformed. It means the mayim has merely been warmed. So if we want to define what is the malacha of bishul, how is mayim transformed, so to speak, al yedei bishul, we would have to say that it's not because it undergoes a transformation in body. Like, for example, if you take a piece of raw butter, it becomes no longer oimtza, but it becomes edible, it becomes softened, it becomes transformed physically, it undergoes a physical process. In the case of mayim, unless one looks at the atomic level, by heating it, it doesn't undergo a physical transformation. Not a discernible one, at least, right?
So then how is there a tzad of ein bishul by mayim if there's no change?
We'll get to that in just a moment.
So in other words, how do we know that change doesn't mean upgrading? How do we know that?
How do we know whether there's ever a concept of bishul by mayim?
Right.
Let's take it step by step. So what we'll argue is, and this is the essential chiddush of the Eglei Tal, which has very broad ramifications, which Be'ez Hashem Be'ikah will be Isaac when we learn the Sugis of bishul, but we'll touch on the Hamshech. Says the Eglei Tal, therefore the definition of bishul in the case of mayim, which is a Mefurisha Mishnah that establishes that there's an Isser of bishul by mayim, must be not because mayim undergoes a discernible physical transformation, but because the transformation of mayim, or what the bishul accomplishes, is what he calls chimum, which is just applying heat to mayim, which is not the classic tikkun of bishul, which is a transformation physically, but is merely adding chayim. Therefore, if that's correct, so since the definition of bishul is chimum, if we would apply then the usual halacha of shlish bishulay or chatzi bishulay, so what would chimum mean? It would be a third or a half along the temperature scale until mayim boils. So the tzibur will be meichel. I'm English and my mind is in metric, so you'll convert to Fahrenheit. But the water boils at 100 degrees Celsius. If we take a third of that, so we're speaking about 30 something degrees. Water at that stage is basically cold, right? Maybe tepid. That's not shlish bishulai. Chatzi bishulai, which is 50 degrees, also has very little benefit. So what the Shulchan Aruch HaRav is saying is, if we apply the conventional geder of chatzi bishulai or shlish bishulai, it's not meaningful in the case of mayim. What discernible tikkun, to use the lashon that was used before, has mayim undergone with shlish bishulai or chatzi bishulai? Now again, these are sugyas which are relevant also, and Be'ez Hashem will learn when we learn the sugyas of bishul, but we'll see in a moment how this has very broad ramifications directly to the svaras of Shia which we've been learning. Zok the Shulchan Aruch HaRav, Kedarka, in a word, he is megala to us a havana in this sugya, and he says in Siman Reishin Daled, Sifyu Daled, Zok the Shulchan Aruch HaRav, he says, Sheyehe shuhus vayoyim, we apply the din of Hananiah of Machal ben Drusai, which is Chatzi Bishul, Sheyuchlu lischamim Chatzi hachimum. He means half of the chimum which the person desires. That's what it means. Half the chimum. So if I want it at a certain temperature, says the Shulchan Aruch HaRav, I want it to be chatzi chimum. That's what Machal ben Drusai means. If it reaches half of where I want the mayim to be, that would be equivalent to Chatzi Bishul.
Where do we find subjective klolim in Hilchos?
Correct. So this is the shaila which we now want to discuss. The Shulchan Aruch HaRav possibly is now, and this was touched on before by one of the shailas that was asked, is now giving us a unique hagdara of Machal ben Drusoi, not just as it impacts the halacha of Hananya, but as it impacts Bishul in general. How do we apply the halacha to the unique situation of Mayim? So if we look in the Inner Moshe, in the Igros Moshe, on the booklet that's on page 121 in the Maramakamis, on Tshuva Chof Dalet, so that's on the right-hand column, just over a third of the way down the page. Ramosha was asked by the Shoyal, Mahu Shir Machal ben Drusoi legabe Mayim. How do we apply the Shir of Machal ben Drusoi? Dihine b'Shulchan Aruch HaDrashaz, the Shoyal quotes the Shulchan Aruch HaRav, Kosav shu kadei chatzi chimum, the Ketzad Misharim Shir Zeh. How do we apply this shir? So the Ramosha says, he says, Hine lo muvan kol kach. He doesn't understand. What does chatzi chimum mean? If we apply our scientific understanding of half of the chimum, then he says, 50 degrees Celsius is barely warm. He says, and to argue that that barely warm state of chatzi chimum should be the shear which would allow shahiyah, he says that can't be. Because there were shonim that hold, and again we'll recall first principles, that there's no issa bishul deraisa after it reaches that stage. Says Ramosha, are we going to argue that by mayim, heating up the water beyond 50 degrees Celsius is not going to be considered active bishul? Of course it's improving the mayim. Especially if we define, like the Eglei Tal, that the ikam malacha of bishul by mayim is chimum, how can we argue that from 50 degrees and on there's no malacha of bishul? That's Ramosha's taina. So Zot Ramosha, he says, therefore we have to say a different hagdara. He says, we're forced to say the Yad Seledis, who shir machal ben Yisrael ze shlish bishul mider chashibus inshe lahachshiv l'mayim mayim vusholim shu dafka ksheyalu resichus harbe uman da omar chatzi bishul kan machal ben Yisrael tzorich yoyse me'at miyad seledis. He says, since a person, we consider water conventionally cooked when it's boiled, even though we don't drink the water at that temperature, but our kettle goes until it clicks off when the water is boiling, which is 100 degrees. So therefore, says Ramosha, shlish bishul would be, he says, it would be when it is close to being ma'aler resichos harbe, and masha'enken chatzi bishul would be tzorich yoyse meyat miyad seledis. Means it has to be hot enough, which would be, like, in Fahrenheit degrees, would be probably somewhere close to 70 something, 75, and according to the mandam chatzi bishul, it would have to be something beyond that. So therefore, Moshe is saying that we have to use a different hagdara than the Shulchan Aruch HaRav. It can't be chatzi chimum, because chatzi chimum would seemingly be measured in terms of temperature, and that wouldn't give us a meaningful shear that beyond which the Rishonim could then say there wouldn't be a malacha bishul deraisa. Zot Moshe, it has to be Torah Yosim and Atmi Atzeledis if we apply chatzi bishul like the Shulchan Aruch HaRav. That's Moshe.
So what's shlish? What's temperature shlish?
Shlish is Yatzeledis. And chatzi is ma'at.
Where do we get that shlish?
Where do we get that shear from? We'll try and come back to the question. We would just want to focus the sugya back to shahiyah rather than the emphasis on bishul, but we'll try and come back to that from here. Zok the Tehillah LeDavid, the Shulchan Aruch HaRav is not making a statement about bishul at all. La'olam, the issue of what the shear would be b'negea to bishul is not what the Shulchan Aruch HaRav is talking about. Zok the Tehillah LeDavid, we're forgetting the context of the Shulchan Aruch HaRav. The context of the Shulchan Aruch HaRav is Hananya and Shayyah. Zot the Tehillah LeDavid, the Shulchan Aruch HaRav is telling us a chiddush. La'olam, it's in degrees. It's chatzi chimum. It would be 50 degrees on the Celsius scale. The reason why that accomplishes Machal ben Drusoi is because once it reaches that point, the person is no longer concerned to be mechater, because he's watching the temperature gauge progress, and he sees if it's reached 50 degrees before Shabbos, we're on our way. I don't need it anymore to be mechater. I'm not concerned about whether or not it will reach hot enough that it should be what I want it to be. It should be Ma'aler Sichos Harbe in the lashon of Moshe. I'm sorry. And it always improves. And we'll come back to that key point with Linei. Therefore, says the Shulchan Aruch HaRav, he says, Elohosam, says the Tilul David, Le'inin Shem Yechate, V'kiven Shem Ischamu Muchatzi Mimashu Roitze Sheyuchmu Shuv Lo Yechate. That's all. L'may nafkimina, and here we get back to Shlomo Shaila. Says the Tilul David, if we want to know what the shear of BISHUL is by Mayim, where we don't have, like we said, the usual criteria of how much physical transformation it's undergone, how much royal achila it is, says the Tilul David, Yad Seledis will be sufficient. We don't have to reckon with how much Chatzi is relative to how much he wants to be Mischamim. As long as we've reached Yad Seledis boy, then it's Mavushal. The equivalent in a liquid of, says the Tilul David, of Mavushal called Sarakoi, or not, or Macha Ben Jusoy, that's the shear is Yad Seledis boy. That's the defining criteria in the case of a liquid.
Yad Seledis called Sarchai with water.
And the Tilul David considers, and that's a sugya that Beis Hashem will have a chance to be basically at length in the sugyas of BISHUL, but the Tilul David has a serious tab that once it's reached Yad Seledis boy, it may be Mavushal L'Kol Days. That is the equivalent of Mavushal in the case of mine because it's reached a certain degree of Chaim.
Not like Ramosha. Ramosha said it's only Bender side.
We'll get to that. But the point that we want to emphasize here is the key distinction, and this is a point in which we'll focus on as concluding svaras in the sugya of Shabbos, that we began with a thesis that discusses whether or not one may be shoyhe tapuchim because tapuchim are nachalim k'lo shem chaim. Tosfos said a svara that the basis of the heter would be is because it's equivalent to Machal ben Jusay. Rabbi Kiva Eger and the Minchas Kohen would then that compelling argument of Tosfos would then mean that tapuchim don't undergo any significant transformation by being heated, and therefore there's no Isser of BISHUL. That what would be mavur from this Tosfos. That's what Rabbi Kiva Eger and Minchas Kohen said. The Eglei Tal is chaylik. The basis of the machlokes is that Tosfos is not making a statement about BISHUL at all. La'olam, there may be an Issa BISHUL, but the basis of the heter is because I'm not going to be mechata, because something that's nechal k'mo shu chai, I'm not concerned about whether or not the degree to which it will be nitzvah. And therefore, to go back to the diuk that was asked at the beginning, Tosfos says the necholim tfei k'mo shen chai mitavshel shen izbashel k'machal ben jusoy. Tosfos' lashon of tfei means that therefore I have no reason to be mechata. Tosfos isn't giving us a relative discussion of what's more nechal or less nechal. Tosfos is saying if machal ben jusoy is a heter that I wouldn't be mechata, kol shekain something which could be nechal chai, I have no concern to be mechata.
Is there enough gemina that the fact that it's tvei? Could you say that's stark and say
Correct. So here you could possibly suggest that we began with a question. The kasha of the Shvisa Shabbos based on the Minchas Kohen. That how can it with the mechaber bring down the halacha of tapuchin if the mechaber is choishish to pass not like Hanania? The answer lies in this word of Tosfos that it's tvei. Tosfos isn't saying that this is based on Hanania. Tosfos is saying that here we have something which Kulei Alma would be made. We could possibly say it. The problem is that both the Tosfos Rosh and the Rosh, when they bring this halacha of the Rashbam, they say kevon the kaimon of the Hanania. So
the Goyin says it.
The Goyin says it, and the Pri Megadim says it, both in Rish Yosef and Pri Megadim. So Rabbi Seina Achronim are memayin in this mahalach in the mechaber. But Lulei Divrayim, this lecher would be a possible mahalach that
the Mishnah says something about it that it's better.
No. The Mishnah Berurah is copying this lashon of the Rishonim, but we don't. The Adrabah, the Bialach himself is muchrach that he learned that the mechaber himself is not being machri on the machlokes. So the mechaber, we don't have a klei mahalach in the Mishnah Berurah. But homios, to come back to the nekuda, there is a basic chiluk that needs to be made between Gidrei BISHUL and between the Gedarim of Shahiya. The Gedarim of Shahiya can be irrespective of the Gedarim of BISHUL. And this is the key nafkamina. La'olam says the Eglei Tal, we can argue with Rabbi Kiva Eger and the Minchas Chinuch. and tapuchin kemois shehein would have an isser of bishul doiraisa if they were nitzle. Tosfos is only specifically referring to issues of shehiyah, when and when not we would be mechater. And we have a nafkamina both l'kula and l'chumra. Let's summarize. L'chumra, we could say that la'olam tapuchin chaim have an isser of bishul. But we have a kula legabi shema yechata because anechal k'may shem chaim. I'm not concerned how much it will be mevushal. We also have an afkamina says a tila david lehetach that la'olam b'negea to bishul the shear of mayim will be yad seledes boy. But legabi chashash chitui we require chatzi bishul because that's the only stage in which a person will no longer be concerned to ensure that his mayim is roi for leil Shabbos. So we've made a clear distinction between these two cities. If we look briefly in the Shayatzim, in Siman Shin Yud Ches, Siv Koton Kuf Yudalid in the Shayatzim. For those that have it not in the booklet, it's in Siman Shin Yud Ches Koton Kuf Yudalid in the Shayatzim. The Mishnah Berurah Halacha in Sharat Tzion rejects Rabbi Kiva Eger. And if we read the Sharat Tzion briefly, I'll just read out the Lashon briefly for the Olam, we'll see how the Sharat Tzion has really summarized what we've discussed to this point. The Sharat Tzion says the following. He says, Hine bo Rambam. Perek tes halacha gimel kosav. The Rambam writes, "Am b'vashel dover shem b'bishul kol tzarkoi, oy she'ein tzarich bishul klal."
One second. If you give us a second. Shin Yud Ches, what was the Sharat Tzion? Yud Dalet 14? 114. If you can put that up somehow. Hold it. Go ahead.
I apologize. That wasn't not in the book.
Sorry, no problem.
So the Sharat Tzion says, "Uposhut lanius daiti." Something which doesn't undergo any improvement whatsoever. It's identical. Ula afuke peres, to exclude peres, says a Sharat Tzion.
In other words, it's mistamik v'raloi, right? L'chayra.
No transformation at all. We'll come to see the Gedorim of mistamik v'raloi in a moment. Says a Sharat Tzion, even tapuchim na amuter b'shehiyah. Undoubtedly, they're improved by the heat. Even though the Mogen Avraham says that water is improved more than Paris, says the Sharat Tzion, we're forced to say that there are three levels here. There's something which is raw, which in BISHUL will be improved, but won't have an Isser of Shahiya. And we have something that will be improved to the point that not just will it have an Isser BISHUL, but it will also have an Isser of Shahiya. So we have three Nidonim. BISHUL, Shahiya, and we have a Nidin of something which has both Dinim. So let's summarize. The Shulchan Aruch says that Peiros have a heter of Shahiya.
Give me a second. I just wanted, if you don't mind, Claire, we're late here, but I want to look at the Kuf Yudal and the Sharat Tzion. You're going the wrong way. The other way. So if you don't mind,
it's in the Mishnah Berurah, it's on the same page that has the
Tzadik Beis, Tzadik Gimel,
which is Sivkot and Tzadik Beis in the Mishnah Berurah.
It's 274 in this old print, in this new print.
Go ahead. One page further.
Yeah.
And one more page. One page further.
So where Yudal is. Okay, in the bottom here, go to Sharat Tzion, Kuf Yudal.
Yes.
I'm sorry, I'm slowing you down.
No, that's fine.
Go down. Because this is hard and we didn't see it before. Please scroll the page down to all the way down to the Sharat Tzion.
Kuf Yudal.
114.
The payers are better raw, and when you cook them, they get a certain.
Sharat Tzion actually looks like it's on the previous.
It's on the page before. Apologize.
The payers are better raw, but they get also a certain improvement when they get cooked. Water is better when it's cooked. What if you have a third thing that's equal? What is equal wrong? Like worse than Paris?
There are things which, when you heat it up, it's exactly the same when it's
Right.
cold.
So that would be a shaila according to the
That's according to the Magen Avraham. Legabi Shehiyah would be mutter, and Legabi Bishul the Sharatzian would concede that would also be.
Mark Kuf Yudalad, please.
So Rabbi say, let's try and summarize now. If we just see the Sharatzian inside, see now inside. He said, "Uposhet laniyus daiti," that the Rambam, when he says in Sorach Bishul Klal Hainu Dover she'enim mishtabech Klal alidei Bishul, and there goes no improvement whatsoever. Ula afuke peiros v'kiyai gav meshu mishtabech alidei Bishul, they are improved. But Teda says the Sharatzian, have a simple proof, which is what we've been discussing. The halimuchach b'gemara b'Shabbos demayim yesh b'mishum Bishul. Water has an iser of Bishul. V'harei mayim gam ken shoysa oisay kshuchai. Water can be drunk raw. Says the Sharatzion, and one can be madche. The mayim loy odif k'moy peris. Mayim is not the same quality as it. Ayin Magen Avraham b'soif siman reish nun daled lechad terutza. He says this will be totally on the two terutzim of the Magen Avraham if water is improved alidei bishul to a greater extent than peris. So the Sharatzion has set up now three categories: not changed at all, somewhat improved, and significantly improved. Not changed at all, no Isser Bishul. That's a Rambam, Inter Bishul Tal. Somewhat improved, the Sharatzion wants to be Metzaget, that's Paris, and will have an Isser Bishul Deraisa, and Mayim is substantially improved. The issue just is, can one bring a proof from Mayim to this question or not? And that depends on the two answers the Magen Avraham. So, L'sikum Advarim, we have that the Mishnah Berurah L'maises Meichilok and Rabbi Kiva is saying that Paris have an Isser Bishul Deraisa. He goes on to bring the Birkei Yosef. Ayin le'el simulation dal safety dal the version the cost of the yesh bezem mishum mevashal mashma mistimas aloshem behudei raisa chen kasal ma primigadim shulchan HaRav and HaRav. So the ma'isa the Sharatzion is chelak on Rabbi Kiva. And the key distinction here is to make a distinction between the sugya of Shahiya and the sugya of Bishul. The sugya of Shahiya and the sugya of Bishul are choluk, both the kula and the chumrah. The chumrah that we can have in Shahiya, something that has an isser of Shahiya, which doesn't have an isser of Bishul, because we need chatzi bishuloi for a mayim, but yatzeledes boy is the cutoff point for Bishul, and who then we have the hepech, that we can have a kula for Paris, that Shahiya is mutter, even though Bishul Sharatzion says there will be. Now, the question was raised before, and this is a very important point, is if we understand from the Shulchan Aruch HaRav and the other Achronim, that the ikar improvement, so to speak, that water has, which qualifies it for Bishul, is like the Eglei Tal says, is chamimus. So how then do we apply the conventional heterim of Hanania? Bishloima in a conventional tavshel, where the issue is how much the tavshel has been made edible. So then we understand that Rachel ben Drusoi defines a stage at which the Meichel becomes edible, and therefore we're no longer Choshesh V'chita. That's mavur in the sugi. But if the ikar by mayim is heat, and the goal is to have mayim that is cham, so then there's always a chashash shami yechate in order to be able to have chamimos.
You can say the same story.
Why don't we find that in the case of mayim there should be again different criteria for the chashash of shami yechate, different to Chananya, because the ikar goal is chamimos. Why don't we find that svara?
A person who wants hot water will be satisfied at minimum this level, just like will be satisfied by food that becomes edible. This comes into the category of hot water, even though it's a shmata.
But if it loses its chamimos, if the eish drops, that's always the chashash. The chashash is that the eish will drop. Right? Always, you're putting it on an eish that's equivalent. Then your intentions don't work out. That's the whole basis of the svara of the sugya, and then there'll be a chashash of chitu to bring it back up. So ordinarily we understand that one wouldn't be mechate if it's already reached that bishul, because even the lower flame will allow it to be rod. So are we always assuming that the lower flame will allow that the mayim will at least remain somewhat hot? What's the svara here? I didn't find the shaila mefurish in Rabbi Seinu Achreinim. Just again, to this key point. We've made a clear distinction between mayim and other macholim b'negeh to bishul. The goal and what defines bishul l'gabi mayim is chamimos. So why doesn't that impact the chashash of Shem Yechate? I don't have a clear Maramakim for the Shaila. The Tila David touches on this briefly, doesn't seem to address the Shaila entirely. There is a very...
that most foods stay.
But we see that we're mechalik between different types of machal and benegeh to the Gdar Mashiach, even lahakal. So we don't have a loy plug, right? We're not mechalik between tabuchim and other things. So just a Maramakim, and again, we'll have a chance to discuss this fundamental shaila when we get to the sugya of hatmana and chazara and shehiya be'issa. And that is that the Shulchan Aruch establishes that in something that's mitztamik v'raloi, right? Again, to go back to first principles, if a shehiya was done on that be'issa, we don't consider that mitztamik v'raloi, once it's mitztamik v'raloi, we do not consider that anything that was gained by the shehiya is significant, and therefore the tashel is mutter. We've learned that in Shulchan Aruch. Now, the question Reb Shlomo Zalman asks, brought in Shulchan Shlomo, in Reish and Gimel Zayin, Reb Shlomo Zalman asks, he doesn't understand. If a tavshel Shabbos morning gets cold, the person doesn't have benefit from the fact that it was warmed up again. So true in terms of the transformation of the tavshel, in terms of being edible, in terms of is it oitz or not, is it raw? True. One doesn't benefit from just heat. But the tavshel is inedible cold. We don't eat cold cholent. So luyitzu, the shehiya warmed up a cholent that was mevushal even cold zarkai, and it's mitzamik v'raloi. Why isn't it considered nene from the shehiya or the chazara or the hatmana? Because it became warm. Somehow Reb Shlomo Zalman says, and he doesn't give a clear explanation why, he says we see that in the halachas of shehiya, chazara, and hatmana, we aren't reckoning just with chamimus. We are only reckoning with nene in terms of transforming something inedible to edible. Otherwise, we don't have a sugya. At the end of Reb Shlomo Zalman's piece, he says, "Ayin Tehillah LeDavid in Zayin in Reish and Gimel." There, the Tehillah LeDavid says a chidush niflo, which is negei ledina, Rabbi Sai, and he says that all that it says in the mechaber that mitztamik v'raloi is not considered shehiya, and therefore there's no issue of nana and issa b'diavad, is only if the tavshel is still warm enough to be edible. But luyitzuya, it wouldn't be. Avada, it would be nana, and the shia would aser it. As they state in. So we had a key question, which we made it in the sugyas of Chazar and Hatmana, where we learned the Gemara Daf Lamed Ches, like the issue of shia b'diavad. We'll have a chance to come back to and learn bi'ir. Do we reckon with changes merely in chamimus in the sugya of shia Chazar and of shia? Do we or don't? But it's a chazara on that. Luyitzu in that case, that is good. But luyitzu in that case is a chazara. So if you've seen Shulchan Aruch, the halacha is that if it's mitzamik v'raloi, which the regular tapshel that usually comes out of the fridge is mutter. You're not nana from it. Why not? You're going to eat the cold. You're not eating cold. So why is that nana from chamimus? So Rosh Hashanah seems to be noted that the stimas apoiskim is that chamimus is not a factor in shehiya and in chazara and in atman. It isn't. But the Tzilul David says it is. And he says, Avada Ledina, we have to qualify the Stimas HaShulchan Aruch to say that Luyitzu one's nene from Chamimus is a chum. So this brings us to now in the last couple of minutes that we have before Be'ez Hashem we begin Divrei Haggadah, to how we apply now the halachas that we have learned about Shehiyas Mayim. How do we apply that to our situation today when we're not leaving Mayim alo Eish in the strictly the lashon of the Shulchan Aruch consideration downstairs, but we're leaving it in a hot water, in a dedicated water heater. So the Shmir Shabbos Hilchos points out, and again, this is a chance to review principles that we've learned Be'ez Hashem in the last number of weeks, that even though when one puts the water, there is clearly a platform, there's an insulation between the water and the heating element underneath, but heating a hot water urn which has adjustable temperature control is not considered garf and cotton, would be considered an eish negula. It's a derech levashel on it, temperature can be altered, and therefore a conventional urn would be considered a garf or cotton.
Conventional meaning more than one temperature.
Correct. In the usual presentation of a water heater, which is powered by electricity, right, just has a simple plate on which the water rests and adjustable temperature control, which controls the thermostat. So the Shmir Shabbos BILCHOS says clearly, he says the stama of a mechamayim is that it's considered to be an eish megur. Now, given that assumption, in that case, when one was putting up an urn close to Knisas HaShabbos, in Shulchan Aruch it says that the Isur Shihya applies to that. We don't consider mayim even for shkia, as the Shulchan Aruch HaRav said, based on one teretz in Magen Avraham. We don't consider mayim as being nechal k'mo yishuchai. It's not analogous to tapuchim. Zot the Shulchan Aruch HaRav, we need chatzi bishul. The chatzi bishul, the Tila David allows chatzi bishul in degrees. Ramosha says chatzi bishul means it has to be at least yatziledes boy, which is a lot higher than that. So therefore, Ledina, if one wants to put up an urn before Shabbos, and in a conventional urn, that's not bar for kotel, the halacha would be that it should probably, lechatchila, should reach close to, again, it's degrees Celsius, we'll do the conversion, it's close to probably around 70 degrees Celsius, it should reach, right? Certainly it should reach minimally 50 degrees if you want to be saimech on the tila levav. So one should be nizir.
That's even before a Moshe's
and that's even before a Moshe's Kumar. That's what we'll get to in a moment. There's another reason why one needs to be machmir, and I want to touch on that briefly because this is really belongs to the sugi of chazara, but is relevant to the sugi of shihya because it comes up in the same context as a ma'aseh shia, and that is a ramah. Where the ramah says l'chatchila one should not place a tavshil in a shihya state if the tavshil will not be heated before Shabbos. If one looks, we'll touch on this briefly because the significance of this Ramah is more the halacha l'maisa than actually for the sugi of shia, but it's very relevant, and that is in Siman Reish Nun Gimel. In Sif Beis.
Page 78.
Page 77. Page 77 in the booklet. Page 77 in the booklet. The Ramah says the following. Third line. Yesh oimrim. De kol ze enu osa raksha notla min akira mi b'idyoim v'leichziru ad shechashecha. And he says that I'm sorry. It's actually on the next page. I apologize. Shlomo, you were correct. On page 78 at the top of the page. I apologize. We'll see. Time will just allow us to see this section of the Ramah. Yesh oimrim, says the Ramah, the koshu somuch l'chashecha, if it's close to night, a somuch l'baruchu, which is this man that the tzibur accepts Shabbos, shu kabbalah Shabbos l'didan. Imu somuch kol kach shem nitztanen akdera i efshel l'articha mi b'id yoim. It will no longer return to a state of boiled from mi b'id yoim. Dinoi kimoi b'Shabbos atzmoi. One cannot put a tavshil on the stove on Erev Shabbos if it will not boil by the time of Knisas HaShabbos.
Why is this chazara? Why isn't this in shia?
Okay. This is an excellent question, and we'll be oisik in this in the sugya of chazara. But if one look what you want, the Olam can see the Mishnah Gura in Sivkot Ayin explains this by BHILCHOS. But the point being is that there is shayim that hold that we made the gzeira that the same way as on Shabbos one can't put back a tavshil on the eish without the conditions of Chazara, which we'll learn Be'ez Hashem. So too on Erev Shabbos we would go there that one cannot put the tavshil or the eish unless it will be hot enough before Shabbos. And I see the Olam is looking kimat tmiyim. This is not a chumrah that we're accustomed to. This is a mufurish Ramah though. That lichatchila, and the Ramah says that ba'avada one can be mekel. He says v'yesh mekilim ezeh v'haminig lahakel ach toiv lahachmer b'makom shein tzorich kol kach. Abai said this is a chumrah that's very negeh Erev Shabbos. When we put up tavshilim on the blech, the tavshil should be put up in time that it could be reheated before Shabbos. Why? Gzeira otu chazara on Shabbos. Chatchila toiv lahachmer. One can be mekel. Now, what does one do? L'maiseh, often we're in a rush and we're putting up tavshil a couple of minutes before the tension, and it's not going to be boiled by the time it's shia. What's the eitzah? So Rav Shlomo Zalman has a gewaldige eitzah, and Rav Shlomo Zalman says that the gezeira is because the fire isn't hot enough for it to be able to boil by the time it's chashecha. So Rav Shlomo Zalman, there's a very simple eitzah. On every range, there's a broiler, there's a high output burner. Very high output burner. He said, turn the high output burner on the highest. So if you would leave the tavshil on that, it would boil in 5 minutes. Put it on, so then there was no isser in the chazara, and then immediately turn it down. It's a very simple eitzah. It doesn't say it has to keep on the fire. It doesn't actually have to boil. The issur is that you can't put it in a state that it wouldn't be able to boil before Shabbos. So Rav Shlomo Zalman put it on thing and turn it down. Turn it down. So there's no. It doesn't. So that's Rav Shlomo Zalman's key point. It doesn't need to happen. You just can't put it in a way that looks like you're doing chazara of a tamshel on Shabbos. So this is an eitzah, both say. If one is a rush to be yoitza the Ramah, l'chatchila to put it up. Just to finish with a point, lahalacha l'maisa, before we begin to B'Yagoda. Many of us have ovens with Shabbos modes. A Shabbos mode oven is generally considered by the poskim, it's important to know this, as not garif and cotton. It's aloish. Even though the controls can't be adjusted once in Shabbos mode, it's aloish. It's megula, it's aloish. If one puts the foil pans or whatever the tavshil is in the tanur right before Shabbos, so again we have this issue of the Ramah that we put it aloish before it's able to be cham. Now, here we don't have Rav Shlomo Zalman's eitzah. Because each time you put it in Shabbos mode, so there are those poskim that say, put it on 500 and immediately turn it down and put it on Shabbos mode, but that doesn't work. Because Rav Shlomo Zalman's only eitzah is leave it on the same eish and turn it down, but if you turn off the oven and then set it to Shabbos mode, Rabbi said this is something to be nizer in the chatchila. Avada the Ramah says that that one can't, but this is the point to be nizer in. One more point before Be'ez Hashem we begin the B'Yagoda. Rav Moshe has another chumrah, a pella of a chumrah. Why one cannot put mayim alo eish or fill our urn and switch it on right before Shabbos. Zot Rav Moshe, because we're choshesh that since the water is not going to boil, you're going to take out water too early on Shabbos, and then there's going to be less water in the urn, in which case the remaining water is going to boil quicker. Rabbi Yisrael will recall that in the very first shir, the very first limud, we discussed that kroive bishul, to make bishul occur quicker, has the same issur of megis, which is an issur of bishul deraisa. We discussed that from Rabbi Kiva Eger. Zot Rav Moshe, if you reduce the level of water in the urn, so the remaining water is going to boil quicker, you have a chashash of a bishul deraisa. Zot Rav Moshe, therefore, you have to put the urn up to the point that by the time the right shkia arrives, you won't have the chashash. Zot Rav Shlomo Zalman, where's this chashash from? Such a chashash. How can we have such a who's shaking Gemara as a chashash? So Zot Rav Shlomo Zalman, he says, Nira that Igros Moshe is kaven raplis hius ba'al. The ein las is chashashas chadashas. Aber l'maiser Rabbi Yisai steht in Igros Moshe as that one should be nizer to ensure that the urn is boiling before Shabbos. At least the Yatzel let us by every mention. So this.
If a black oven, Shabbos, and it goes back on. It comes cold and it goes back on. It's not.
That touches on an entirely different issue of Shabbos, which is discussed in the previous limud, and discusses the issue of Ma'im Shalchum Shabbos, which is beyond the scope of today's limud. But then when we learn about BISHUL and Zeres Mechatzois, we'll be Isaac.
I think we should make a sikum. Yeah.
So this brings us to the end of this limud in terms of halacha. Just briefly, as Shlomo has asked, let's briefly summarize the points. We began with the Tosfos in the name of the Rashbam that Peres Ta'anechal K'moishu Chai don't have an issur of Shahiya. We discussed whether that's because there's no issur of Bishul because they're Nechal Chai, or whether this is a unique svara b'negea to the din of Shahiya. We then went on to discuss the Shulchan Aruch that says that Mayim is an issur of Shahiya. We discussed what Yatzuledes by Chatzi Bishul would mean. That's David's fundamental chiluk between Shahiya and Bishul. We then discussed the practical applications of that in terms of Mayim. We said that a usual urn that has adjustable controls is considered a negar from Kotum. We discussed that therefore that would mean it should reach Yatzuledes by before Shabbos. We discussed the chumrah of the Ramah that one cannot place Mayim. We discussed before close to Shkia without it being Cham. We discussed the Eitz of Rav Shlomo Zalman of raising and lowering the fire. We discussed whether or not that will apply to our Tanurim. And we discussed the chumrah of Rav Moshe not to have Mayim accessible that has not yet been Mizbashal because of the chashash that we'll take out, and Rav Shlomo Zalman's Hagdara that is a Zehiras Yisera. And just to conclude with Divrei Agoda, we are still in the period of the 7 days after Shavuos, which Mishnah establishes that Atzeres has Tashlumim Kol Shiva. the korbanos that of Oilasriya that one would be mechuyev to bring on Yom Tov have tashlumim kol shiv. From there comes a minig, some have a minig in Klal Yisrael, that therefore there's no tachanun, this Shiva Yomim after Shavuos, because Atzeres says tashlum. There's a fascinating suffix that Rabbi Shua Leib Diskin has in his Gilyonis and Shulchan Aruch, where he discusses that if Shavuos has tashlum kol shiva, is there a mitzvah of lahakdol pnei rabbi on these Shiva Yomim? Now, if that sounds like a Chiddush Gadol, we have a Chok Yaakov, that the Chok Yaakov says is Mesupik, that perhaps if one didn't make a Shechionu on Shavuos, one can be mashal in the bracha of Shechionu for Shiva Yomim after Shavuos, because Atzeres has Tashlum. The Teres Rafal Volozhin in the Sefer says that Avadanat, one can only make Shechionu on the Yom that has this full Kedusha of Shavuos, and that Yom requires Issa Malacha. But the Chok Yaakov claims such a shayla. We see that these Shiva Yomim after Shavuos have much of the Kedusha, much of the Oiris of the Yom of Shavuos itself. We have a shayla b'negeh to Shechionu, and we have a Maral Diskin that discusses whether or not one can still be the candidates of Hakuk Meirabah on these Yom. There's a classic Tshuva Noda B'Yehuda, which may be familiar to many to the Olam, where the Noda B'Yehuda explains that the reason why there is a mitzvah Hakuk Meirabah B'Regel is because any Yom that has special karbonos indicates that there's special oiros in that Yom, and if there's special oiros in that Yom, the Rav gets special siyata b'shnaya to be zeicha to a higher madrega in hasaga b'Torah, which he then gives over to his talmidim. As I say, now he's told that on Yom that have musaf, and even though Atzeres says tashlum kol shiva, there's no musafim in these Yom, so we can be mesupik how BISHUL Leib understood. But what we see is that in the Shiva Yomim after Atzeres, the oiros of the Yom Atzeres remain. Shechion is a possibility, Hakuk Meirabah is a possibility. The Noda B'Yehuda possibly will say that some of the oiros and the miyuchadika shefa of Torah that came in Chag Atzeres is nimshach the Shiva Yom after. Atzeres has tashlum kol shiva. He said this, and there are many men who have in Klal Yisrael a minute not to say tachan for Shiva Yom after, to remain with the me'ain of the yontif. So in these Shiva Yomim after Atzeres, we still remain with a lot of with much of the koyach and much of the segula and much of the oil of these yomim. Much of the koyach to be able once again to bind ourselves to Torah, to dveikus b'Hashem that comes from Torah, to be massive greater hasagas than we've had until now, and Torah remains in these yomim. These are yomim in which we can still absorb and gain from and integrate much of the oiros of these yomim. There's a chiddush nifla on the Chasam Sofer. And we'll connect this with, and this will finish being with the sugya that we learned together, Erev Yom Tov. Chasam Sofer, we recall that the Chasam Sofer had discussed the Kash of Tosfos, that on Shavuos, even though the mitzvah of Simchas D'Oraisa, Chazal still place in the way of Simchas Yom Tov, Yisurim D'Rabbanan. We discussed this. Chazal still were maimed Shavuosim, even though on Atzeres, Kule alma moide de beino lachem is a chila b'shtia deraisa. The Chacham still made it zeri. You can't bring Michael Mishter. Rashi says from chutz latchum. So Tosfos asked. So we see that there's an instance of a chila of deraisa where Chacham were maimed gedarim against the mitzvah deraisa. Does that apply everywhere else? Chasam Sofer Joshua says like this. He says we're all familiar with the shayla that Klal Yisrael said Nasa v'nishma and Klal Yisrael in the Kabbalah Torah b'kfir. The difference is, Medrash Tanchuma says that Torah Shebechsav, Klal Yisrael accepted Baratzim, Torah Shebal Peh, Klal Yisrael accepted B'Kfir. Zod Chasam Sofer, the Iker Kfir of the Yom of Ma'amad Har Sinai was doing the Kabbalah B'Rabbanon. He said, what would it look like if we had a Yom of Shavuos where we were Mevatel B'Rabbanon? Wouldn't that show that we only have a Nichusa and Mekayim Deraisa, but Chas v'Sholom somehow our appreciation and our being Oduk in Gezeres B'Rabbanon is somehow weakened? Because the Yom of Atzeres of Kabbalah Sater Deraisa is Mechayev also a Kfir on the Rabbanon. That's the Yom in which Chachamim were Ma'amid Devrei. That's the Yesod of the Kfir. So to finish with the following Nekuda, Rabbi say, we've been learning in the last number of weeks the Sugya of Shia. The Sugya of Shia is Kol Kula Gezeres Rabbanon. Of course, we encountered many times how this is based on Isurim Deraisa, Havara, how it's based on Isurim Deraisa BISHUL. We just had a limud together in which we saw how these studies are integrated. But the Yisrael Advarim is Derabbanan. Our whole Erev Shabbos is defined by Gzeres Derabbanan. Chazon Ish writes in Igeres in one place in Tama'ayin Roiv Advarim Shalom L'Kaimim. Most of my activities that we carry out during the day are dinim Derabbanan. Very little Deraisa says the Chazon Ish that we carry out. Imagine, Tefillah is Machlokes Rishonim. Krishna, Birchas Hamazon, if we ate last. Some Rishonim hold only Achila and Shtia at Kedei Svia. If one makes a cheshbon, we're surrounded by the Rabbanon. So even what we do, Gzeres Rabbanon. It's appropriate that Rabbi said that we're concluding this section of our limud on Gzeres Shabbos. Gzeres Rabbanon in the Yomim when we still have the Oiros of the Yom HaShavuos. The Oiros of Yom HaShavuos is the Yomim which we are makabel, not just Teresh B'Chsav, when we makabel Teresh B'Al Peh, when we makabel Gzeres Rabbanon. She is kol kula Gzeres Rabbanon. Zot Rabbeinu Yonah and Shargim, familiar Rabbeinu Yonah. It's kedai to review his lashon again. He says that someone who is pirate together the Rabbanon is muhamor in certain instances, and someone who's over on the Issa Deraisa. Why? Because the Isurim the Rabbanon are there as a missionaries for the Deraisa to show our chashivos for the Deraisa. He says, "I ravim divrei soifrim yosem yena shal Torah." Because the whole Rabbanon indicates not just the chashivos for the Geder Rabbanon, but our chashivos for the Deraisa, which Chachamim have a tzivui to make up missionaries to missionarity. I rave in divrei seifrim yosem yena shal Torah. This should be our chizuk in easy honor, having been omel b'siyata d'shmaya b'chabura in sugis that are oisik in the Rabbanon, because part of the oyer of the Yom Tov Shavuos is Gzeres Rabbanon, and dafka on that yom, hemidu divrei the makam the mitzvah.
Okay, Rabbi Sai, Yeshakayach, we'll see you at 10 to 9 tonight for Chazar Shir, and we'll be back live at 11 o'clock in the morning on Sunday to Chazar Shir of Minchas Asher. It'll be on Sugya Berchis Kahanim. Those who I don't see until then, a good Shabbos. Okay, Rav Tzvi.